So, as you likely know, I plan the themes for worship services well in advance. So, sometime in March, I decided the theme today should be something around freedom. And that seemed simple enough back in March. But now that the day is here, when I reflect on the word freedom, I have to confess, I don't think I know exactly what I'm going to talk about, but I know why. So, that's something. The word freedom, of course, sounds wonderful. We all want freedom, right? We probably all want more freedom in life, whether that's political freedom, economic freedom, personal freedom, social freedom. Well, great, but what is freedom anyway? So we could begin with a standard definition, like freedom is the ability to do what we like, to act without interference, to be unconstrained by outside agents. That seemed like a nice general definition. And that definition might even work in some cases. But outside of an AI created universe, I don't quite know how that freedom could ever be practiced. Here are some obvious problems with that definition. For me, the most obvious problem is that we live in community, and so our actions affect other people. For example, if my neighbor is free to sing karaoke at full volume at 2 in the morning, then I'm not really free to get a good night's sleep, am I? Another obvious problem with the definition is that our world is itself a large community. For many people in North America, our economic freedom comes at the expense of income inequality and the exploitation of workers. Does that really qualify as freedom? Does my freedom entitle me to economically enslave other people? Do other people have the freedom to economically enslave me? Something's a little weird anyway. The word freedom is also confusing because it's a different word than the word peace, and yet those two concepts seem to be linked. As Malcolm X said, you cannot separate peace from freedom because nobody can be at peace unless they have their freedom. Which all leads me to wonder, probably because I'm just back from a break, is freedom a good topic to talk about today or not? And to answer that question, I'm going to rely on a phone a friend, metaphorically, because I want to bring Jesus into this conversation. I need a little backup here. What did Jesus say on the subject of freedom? Well, Jesus, I think, is very helpful to this conversation. Because, for one thing, some of the freedoms I listed before, I don't think Jesus actually cared about. So maybe that will simplify our discussion a bit. Jesus did not seem to care about economic freedom. He lived himself as an unemployed homeless person. Jesus told rich people to give away all their possessions to find freedom. Jesus said that birds don't work, and look, God takes care of them. So I think Jesus did not care about economic freedom. I don't think Jesus cared about political freedom. I mean, we're told that the Jews in Jesus' day were waiting for a Messiah who would liberate them from the Roman occupation of Palestine. But Jesus never spoke about the Roman occupation. Jesus never challenged the occupation. In fact, Jesus' strongest criticisms were aimed at uncaring religious leaders. I don't think Jesus cared about political freedom. Jesus did care about freedom, but freedom in the sense of spiritual freedom, personal freedom. For example, as we read earlier, and thank you, chat, quote, "Come to me, all that are weary and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, that's a message about personal freedom, or spiritual freedom, not the promise of wealth and economic freedom, not an incitement to fight for political freedom, personal freedom. So if we restrict our conversation to personal freedom, maybe we can get somewhere. However, even personal freedom isn't quite that simple, which is why I selected the text from Romans today. Because the words from St. Paul's in the book of Romans that we read are a sharp contrast to the words we read from the Gospel of Matthew. I mean, we have Jesus saying, "My yoke is easy, come and find rest." And we have St. Paul in Romans who admits he finds life and the choices he has to make very hard. The words of Jesus are encouraging, engaging, comforting. St. Paul's words are discouraging, disempowering, maybe even scary. St. Paul's words also perhaps resonate with us a little more than we like. Quote, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." How close to home are those words for each of us, at least some of the time? Jesus speaks about peace and freedom, but St. Paul seems to be tortured by demons in his own life. St. Paul does not appear to be living in peace. So, what did Jesus know that St. Paul seems to have missed? And I guess to be fair to Paul, should start by remembering that Paul was a Pharisee before he joined the Jesus movement. And the Pharisees were big on pushing the rule side of religion, or at least telling other people to follow the rules in religion. For example, in Matthew 23, quote, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others. But they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them.'" And St. Paul, at least the part the chat read, speaks as if he is suffering under a heavy burden. At the time that Paul wrote Romans, his understanding of his own faith was evolving from a rule-based mentality he got from the Pharisees into something new from the Jesus movement that was still in the process of becoming. So what did Jesus actually offer? What did Jesus offer beyond a rules-based approach to life and faith? And I want to share an analogy with you, and I hope it works. And if not, you can tell me later. But the tension between how St. Paul and Jesus viewed faith is, I think, a bit like how we learn a new language. Because one way to learn a language is to learn the rules, the grammar, the vocabulary, the mechanics of the language. And of course, that is somewhat important. But you could learn 100% of the rules of a language and still be completely incapable of holding a decent conversation. The other part of learning a language is fluency, where we have internalized enough of the rules that we stop needing to try to follow the rules. Instead, we read the room, we read the situation, we engage with another person. We do not just know how to conjugate the verbs. And that's the difference between St. Paul and Jesus in one analogy. Paul is still working on the grammar, checking the rules, what's permitted, what's forbidden, when are exceptions allowed. Whereas Jesus is fluent. Jesus looks at a woman caught in adultery, a leper, a tax collector up a tree, and he doesn't run his argument through a grammar checker. Jesus just speaks from the heart. And what comes out is always love, because love is the language that Jesus speaks fluently. And I realize this is where maybe it's uncomfortable for us a little bit, because most of the time, I think most of us like rules. I mean, rules are safer. Rules tell us what we have to do. Rules tell us when we can stop helping somebody. Rules let us stop helping because we've done our duty. And following rules does not require any vulnerability. We just blame the rules. But fluency asks more of us. Fluency asks us to actually be open to the person in front of us and to respond to them as a person. Fluence is an exercise in vulnerability. But fluency is the only thing that's ever going to produce decent conversation. Now let's forget that analogy in case it didn't work at all and switch back to the language of faith. Because in short, St. Paul cared about the religious rules and Jesus cared about individual people. And for that, St. Paul was self-tormenting and Jesus offered life, healing, peace, freedom. St. Paul was calculating his faith. Jesus was living his faith. The faith that Jesus shared leads to freedom. And freedom was never just a rule that we can follow. Freedom is a relationship that we are invited to enter into. And this is one reason why we're this week starting our 3-week Healing Circles for Forgiveness groups. Because sometimes we get stuck in the rules and we forget about relationships ourselves. And we've all learned some pretty unhelpful rules, I think, about forgiveness. For example, one I think unhelpful rule is we cannot forgive others until the other person apologizes. Now, granted, that may work in some cases, but it doesn't always work because if somebody has offended us, they may have forgot about it decades ago, even though we're still carrying it around. Is it realistic to wait for an apology? Or the person may have died. We don't have to wait for an apology, but that's a rule that holds us back. Now, the rule is we have a duty to withhold forgiveness because we have to teach the other person a lesson. And again, that to me fails for the same reason. It can work. It can work if it's done very soon and timely, but often we just find we have to hold this. And why should we, the victim, feel we have to manage the emotions of the other person anyway? I think that's where we often get stuck. I've heard this one many times. I have the right to be angry. Okay, you do have the right to be angry because somebody hurt you. But if this is decades later, are you enjoying holding all this anger? Why are you holding all this anger? Yes, you have the right. And I've had many arguments where people ended with, I've got the right to be angry. And yes, you do. But is that how you want to live your life? And finally, that forgiving means we have to forget. And I think that's a very dangerous statement because if somebody has proven themselves untrustworthy, I think we're allowed to remember that. Otherwise, we're opening ourselves up to just be injured again and again. So these rules combined, I think, can contribute to making our lives miserable. Just like for St. Paul, who was pretty good at torturing himself too. But Jesus offers freedom and peace through relationships, including having a good, loving relationship with yourself. So if you feel like you've been withholding forgiveness for a long time, please come to one of our forgiveness groups. Perhaps the person you need to forgive is yourself. But come and find the freedom that you deserve. When you find peace within yourself, in fact, you become the kind of person who can live at peace with others. You have nothing to lose. I wonder if we think we ourselves have fully embraced the type of freedom that Jesus was talking about. Or do we struggle like Paul does with the tension between feeling our freedom, the freedom of the Spirit, and our own internally felt need to create and follow rules? We can easily get locked into patterns that prevent us from finding our own freedom, because we sometimes only want freedom on our own terms. As Richard Rohr said, how odd it is that God's salvation is so seldom recognized. Oh, yes, we want help, we want solace, we want magic. But I'm not sure we recognize or even want the scary freedom that God calls salvation. Jesus offers us freedom. What does freedom look like to you? We all have our own idea, I think, of what freedom looks like. And personally, I think that's fantastic. Marjorie and I have done a lot of camping, usually in provincial parks. And I'm always amazed how different people create their own sense of freedom and safe space in provincial parks. Because I just love, you walk around a park and you see what people are doing, that clearly they're getting away from it all. They're finding freedom. But there's so many different ways to do it, even though we all get our stuff from Canadian Tire, right? Camping itself is an expression of freedom, being away from it all. But people camp in very different ways. Some people's idea of freedom is to have a massive RV that contains more items than I probably have in my own house. On our last camping trip, I was also struck by how many people had strung lights all around their campsite, hooked to gasoline generators, turning the campsite into this flood of light and sound. It's like, cool, okay. Other people, like Margie and I, are a little more minimalistic. They try to have as little physical presence as possible while camping. Perhaps only a small pup tent that emerges from some impossible space on a motorcycle. leaving great emotional space in the campsite itself. And to be clear, I'm not saying one approach is right and one is wrong. I just never cease to be amazed at what people find comfortable, safe, liberating. Freedom means many different things to different people, and freedom is personal, and that's okay. I think Jesus came closest to an understanding of freedom in the Sermon on the Mount. In that long sermon, Jesus says many things, of course, but he emphasizes 2 points that are all about personal freedom. In one place, Jesus tells us not to worry, and right after that, to not judge other people. And I think perhaps that's actually a single idea, not two, because judging others very quickly leads us to worrying about all kinds of things. The freedom that Jesus speaks of is a personal freedom to not get drawn into judging and therefore worrying and therefore becoming afraid. Perhaps we tend to read over that text too quickly because it's so long. But our own freedom, in part, comes from letting go of our own expectations and living with actual reality, rather than trying to hang on to an image of a reality that does not exist. Personal freedom is not just about being free from control, but as Dostoevsky said, freedom is an opportunity to control yourself. And of course, as I said, because we do not live alone, our own personal freedom is connected to the freedoms of those around us. Nelson Mandela said to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Freedom is not only about being free to serve ourselves, but about creating opportunities to love and serve one another, including ourselves. And once again, we get straight back to the wisdom of Jesus, who said that the most important commandment was, in fact, 3 commandments. Good math there, but to love God, love others, love yourself. We are all called to love and serve others. And that's precisely where we find our own freedom. We're given an image by Matthew this morning of being yoked with Jesus, as if, I guess, we're working some land. So I thought, well, but we're working the land with Jesus by our side. So let's extend the idea by imagining you're pulling a plow, because it doesn't say what farm equipment we're doing here. But if you're plowing, think of your life. What furrows have you been plowing in your own life? And have they led to helping you find freedom? And if not, consider perhaps where Jesus thinks maybe you should plow instead. Where is Jesus leading you? Where do you feel the tug to explore new paths with openness that lead to discovery, new relationships, and freedom? Perhaps the tug you feel is from God. Respond to the tug of God and find your freedom. And I want to give the last words to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These are aspirational words. I don't think any of us live here, but they're an aspiration, and I put them on the screen so we can all say them together. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Amen.